Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. We have a terrific lineup of members here to talk about a number of issues. Obviously, the Republicans had a tremendous week last week. Now that impeachment is over, however, we want to make sure people recognize and understand that for the Democrats, they're going to be back to the kind of business as usual with their policies that we've seen consistently. What they demonstrated to us over the course of impeachment and since then, and before they began impeachment, was that they absolutely cannot be trusted. And we are seeing both here in the House as well as on the campaign trail a series of policies that would bring socialism to this country. I'm sure you all saw on the debate stage only one of their candidates, and it was with a lot of hesitation, raised her hand when the question was whether you'd be troubled by having a socialist at the top of the ticket. So we're going to continue to fight to make sure the American people don't forget the damage that the Democrats have done. It's particularly clear this week as the president has unveiled his budget request, and that's what we've got our members here to speak about. But don't forget, as you hear them talk about the president's budget, the fact that the Democrats once again don't have a budget. Once again, the Democrats haven't produced a budget. That is largely because of the cost of the proposals their presidential candidates and many of their members of Congress have put forward. $32 trillion health care plan that would eliminate all private insurance, at least $93 trillion, and frankly, probably much more in terms of the Green New Deal, which would abolish the use of fossil fuels, outlaw airplanes, cars, embracing socialism across the board, opening up borders, abolishing ICE. In addition to those and to the cost that they know they can't agree on and they know they can't put down on paper because the American people would absolutely reject it, their policies have refused to stand up for the state of Israel. They've refused to protect the unborn, and they've taken action that would violate our First Amendment rights, our Second Amendment rights, and put legislation forward and supported legislation that emboldens America's adversaries, weakens this president, weakens our ability to defend the nation. So we look forward as this year progresses to being able to bring the message to the American people of a party that is very much focused on what's necessary to continue the tremendous policies of President Trump, to continue the growth, the opportunity, and the restoration of our national security we've seen under this president. We think the contrast with the Democrats will be very clear, and the choice will be a clear one as well. With that, I'm going to turn things over to the Republican leader of the Budget Committee, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack, to talk a little bit about the president's budget.
Good morning. I thank the conference chair for the opportunity. Look, I applaud the president for putting forward a budget proposal. That's a lot more than I can say from my friends on the other side of the aisle. As you've already heard, for the second straight year, House Democrats that lead the Budget Committee will not produce a budget. That's not leadership. The president's budget includes deficit reduction measures, specifically $4.6 trillion between 2021 and 2030. That's a nice start, but a lot more work remains to be done to put our country on a solid fiscal path. Our debt is over $23 trillion. Deficits continue to rise, and we're headed toward a fiscal crisis in our nation. The time to act is now. Unfortunately, there seems to be little motivation within the Democrat majority to start making the tough budgetary decisions necessary to reverse the course. In the House Budget Committee, we've heard from outside experts time and time again about the daunting reality of our fiscal trajectory, and yet it seems the Democrats are not taking these warnings seriously. Policies promoted by some Democrats, like Medicare for All and the Green New Deal, would increase mandatory spending by tens of trillions of dollars, thus drastically adding to the national debt. And frankly, I know that's why my counterpart in the Budget Committee, John Yarmuth, cannot produce a budget, because he knows it would be loaded with programs that would be crushing in terms of its impact on future generations. Put it plainly, There's no better indicator of where Democrats are headed than where they've already been. In this Congress alone, House Democrats have already violated their own pay-go rules 25 times. If you ask me, that's pretty clear evidence that our colleagues across the aisle don't care about the fiscal crisis we face that will negatively impact every single American. Tomorrow, the House Budget Committee will hear from OMB Acting Director Russ Vought regarding the President's fiscal 2021 budget request. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I hope that more eyes will be open to the stark reality we'll face. I will also be interested to see how many committee Democrats will harshly criticize the President's budget, knowing full well that they failed to produce one of their own. In every reputable business, every local and state government, the fiscal plan of the entity begins with a budget. But here we are, the greatest nation in the history of the world, and we can't even muster something as simple as a budget. We must start doing our job to put our country on a sustainable, responsible fiscal path. This is our duty to the American people, not promoting budget-busting policies that will leave future generations saddled with the consequences of congressional Democrats' eagerness to spend with no way to pay. It's time for Democrats to roll up their sleeves, join us at the table to do the difficult work. President Trump is leading on the issue. He put forward a budget. Democrats have not. Doing nothing is no option. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Womack. And now I'd like to recognize the Republican leader of the House Armed Services Committee, Mr. Thornberry, to discuss the President's defense budget request.
The administration's budget request for defense is consistent with the two-year budget deal that was reached last year. That means it's a 0.3% increase over this year's budget. Now, obviously, the world has gotten a lot more dangerous than 0.3%, thinking about the Iranian activities, North Korean missile launches, all of China's activities. And so what the Pentagon has done is looked internally for savings. That means doing less of some of the things that we have been doing in order to fund the capability we need for the future. And I think it's going to be a major test for this Congress, whether we are able to take the longer, broader view in thinking about the future, even though it means doing some things, less of some things that we're doing now. If you look at this budget request, number one is people, a 3% pay raise. Number two, the largest budget ever for research and development. And that's part of where those savings go, to fund more things like hypersonics, artificial intelligence, space, some of the areas where others are actually ahead of us. There's also a major increase on missile defense so that we can not only protect our troops in the field, but do better at protecting our homeland. And certainly the nuclear deterrent, increasing the credibility of the nuclear deterrent upon which we have depended for so long is a major priority. Through neglect and maybe wishfulness, we have let all aspects of the nuclear deterrent wear out at the same time. So we've got to buy new subs, new bombers, new missiles. We've got to fix the weapons. We've got to repair and replace nuclear command and control all at the same time. At no point does that take more than 6% of the defense budget, but it is the foundation upon which all the remainder of our defense efforts rest. One last point. You take all this, looks like, all this stuff we're doing for defense, it's still 15%, 15% of the federal budget. It was about 50%, of course, during John Kennedy's day. It is about 3% of the gross domestic product. That is close to the lowest it has ever been in the country's history. We got down to 2.7% in 1999. Not so much to ask to defend everything else that the country has and the American people.
Thank you, Mac. Now I'd like to yield to the Chief Deputy Whip, Mr. Ferguson from Georgia.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And
Boy, what a week of contrast we had last week. When I was home this past weekend, the energy level among voters was really high, and the topics that they were talking about, quite candidly, were the contrast between the president's actions and where the socialist Democrats are. Simply look at on day one of last week and Monday. On Monday, you had the president in Iowa generating tremendous enthusiasm, high record turnout votes for the caucus there, and yet the Democrats still cannot count votes in Iowa. I think that was a sharp contrast. The State of the Union speech, boy, what a remarkable speech by the president, highlighting many of the accomplishments of this administration and really laying out a vision for the future. And that was a sharp contrast to Nancy Pelosi standing behind the podium and tearing up the speech like a petulant child. Another sharp contrast. And on Wednesday, as our colleagues Schiff and Nadler continued to push forth the narrative on impeachment and the hoax of impeachment, the president was acquitted in the Senate. And so I think that we had a very sharp contrast, and I think America is responding to that. If you look at what's going on this week, Nancy Pelosi is again asking her members to take an unconstitutional vote on the ERA bill that they're going to put forward this week. It is really nothing more than a messaging bill, and it is remarkable to me that in a week where we're going to also have where we've had the president's budget unveiled, the Democrats have failed to produce a budget, as Nancy Pelosi tends to try to wrap herself in the Constitution, and she seems to only do it when it's convenient. She is ignoring her constitutional responsibility of the leader of the Socialist Democratic Party to produce a budget, and really, quite candidly, the shameful acts of tearing up a speech at the State of the Union. Sharp contrast. America is responding. We're going to keep telling the story of a bright future for this country, and we're going to continue to show, along with the help of the Socialist Democrats, their vision of destroying this country. And with that, I will turn it over to our leader. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. I think Drew was right. The contrast was tremendous. Last week showed two directions for America. If you looked at the president from the State of the Union, one of the best I've ever heard, then you watched him get acquitted for life. You watched the jobs report. Many people predicted around 100,000, more than doubling. Shows a continued growth. Then we received the good news. Our U.S. forces took out a terrorist leader that had claimed responsibility for the attacks that killed 3 of our service members in Naval Air Station Pensacola. And the president produced a budget. Compare that to the Democrat majority inside the House. They've got trouble. They had trouble with turnout in Iowa. They have trouble with temper tantrums during a State of the Union. They had trouble with the truth, impeachment. And to quote the Speaker, show me your budget, show me your values. I think the number one responsibility of a majority is to plan for the future. Once again, no budget. I wonder if the Speaker will actually propose eliminating the Budget Committee because they have no work to do in this new majority of not producing a budget itself. Last night I was in New Hampshire with the president. I've watched Democrats spend millions of dollars trying to get a turnout. I watched the president produce one rally that produced much more than all of them combined. The enthusiasm there was tremendous. The number of people, packed house and outside, and others. Same as we saw within Iowa. Something people did not report from Iowa, that the turnout from the Democrats was a decrease in turnout, and the president set a new record for any president running for re-election on a turnout in Iowa. The enthusiasm gap within the Democratic Party is shown time and again. This president also, on the way up there, changed course. Gave a shorter rally than times before. Because what the president did instead was to go to Dover. We understand the cost of freedom, and this president understands it greatly. The president wanted to make sure, because this weekend our country lost 2 heroes. Sergeant First Class Gutierrez and Sergeant First Class Rodriguez. Last night the president, when he traveled to Dover, was with them, with the families. We continue to keep them in our prayers, but we understand what the cost of freedom is about. When you listen to Mac Thornberry and Steve Womack, they understand what it means to have the responsibility to protect our men and women, and understand to be able to plan within a budget to produce that, to keep the world free at the same time, to keep our troops. That's the fundamental difference between the Americas of this Republican Party and the Democrats. They won't even produce a budget to lay out a framework of what the world should look like. And I think that's why they're having a turnout decrease across the country. With that, I open it up for questions. Yes, sir.
Mr. Leader,
Yes.
we haven't spoken to you since last Friday when the president dismissed Colonel Vindman and Ambassador Sondland. Your reaction to that, and also several senators in the wake of the verdict last week said that they had hoped that the president had learned a lesson. Some people said they thought he had learned a lesson. Do you think the president has learned a lesson from the impeachment saga?
I think there's a lot of lessons to learn. The first one, I'd go to the Intel Committee. That we have a chairman on the Intel Committee that read a transcript that was not true to the American public. We have a chairman of the Intel Committee who came before the American public and said he had a great fear that the administration was going to withhold a whistleblower from giving information. We learned later that this same chairman actually met with this whistleblower, and the only transcript that was withheld from the basement of those interviews was the 18th, the one about the Inspector General. All he needs to do is bring the committee together to vote to release that transcript. I wonder what that transcript would read. Could it possibly state out that the member who is the chairman of the Intel Committee could be a fact witness? Could it come forth that he met with this individual before, the only person in Congress who would know who the whistleblower is? Could he have just taken America through a second nightmare when we could have been focusing on so many other items? I think that's the biggest lesson for America to learn. And I think the Democratic Party, in their own civil war, based upon the speakers jumping to an impeachment, based upon following Adam Schiff, I think there's a great frustration. And when they talk about lessons, I believe that's the lesson.
Why was it appropriate for the president to take the action he did against Colonel Vindman?
Well, is it appropriate for the news to say he was fired when he was not? He was reassigned. I think that is appropriate. Yes.
I wanted to ask about some comments that the whip made on television last night about the Durham investigation. Mr. Scalise effectively said that having read classified evidence relating to these matters, he's convinced that people should go to jail. Your reaction to that? Have you read any classified evidence that convinces you people should go to jail?
I have not. I did not see the interview. I was with the president. I do not know from that. I think there's a question for Steve, but I would leave it up to Durham to do his investigation and come back. I make no predetermined judgment. Let him find out the information, and let's have a level playing field, find out what happens. Yes.
Last question. The House GOP this morning approved Jim Jordan for Judiciary and Mark Meadows to be a ranking member on Oversight. Obviously, it's no secret they didn't always have a great relationship with you. Jordan ran against you once for Minority Leader. I just wanted to hear your comment on them being elevated, please.
Well, in steering committee, I think made an excellent decision. And one thing you should know, yes, Jim Jordan and I had a competition to become leader. But I called Jim Jordan after that and asked him to become the ranking member on Oversight. I think Jim Jordan has done an excellent job. The one thing I would take from all this, you have a united Republican Party. We're united in the facts. We're united in fighting for the American public. Much different in a contrast to the Democratic Party, where they have their own civil war. First, internally inside this House, the number of Democrats who are fearful of losing their seats based upon the decisions the Speaker made about moving forward in impeachment and trusting Adam Schiff, who continued to lie to them themselves. Then you've got a civil war on the national pages that you see Bernie Sanders in the lead, and once again, the Democratic Party trying to steal the nomination from Bernie Sanders. Remember, just 4 years ago, the chair of the Democratic National Committee had to resign the night before their convention because truth came forward inside emails that they had rigged the system to make sure Bernie could not win. They changed the process, so there's no superdelegates on the first round. They thought they fixed Iowa. Interesting that the poll the night before that has always come forward could not come forward. It's interesting the night of the election they could not report any who was winning from a lead within that Bernie Sanders had. It's interesting that the Speaker of the House saying that she had to rush through an impeachment and then hold the papers, which gave an advantage to Joe Biden and Mayor Pete and a disadvantage to every senator who was running for president. Bernie Sanders being one of them and in the lead. It's interesting to me how divided the Democratic Party. Even if you talk to Democrats inside Congress, they will not say they are Democrats. They will claim that they are socialist Democrats, and this is the new movement within the party. And I would take from the aspect of what you saw within our steering committee to get to today, we are probably more unified as a party than we've ever been. And we're open to more people willing to join us, just as we had Jeff Van Drew join us from a Democrat to a Republican. I think that's probably one of the biggest signs you'll see that America is open and ready for a different direction inside the majority. I'll make you this one promise. If they would trust us with being the majority, we'd be a majority that gave you a budget, that wouldn't hide from the facts of the plans for the future. And we'd be a majority that would not use impeachment simply because of the animosities that you have for somebody else. We'd be a Congress that would work for the American public, not for their party. Thank you.